Well, hello and welcome to another online Bible study on the book of Joshua. This is our 24th in this series, and this is our final in this series. We're looking at the conclusion to the book of Joshua. We're going to be focusing on really Joshua's questions that he posed to Israel and their response, and you find that in chapter 24, verses 14 through 18. Then when we look at these, well, let's just get started, read the verse, and then begin to dissect it a little bit and see if we can learn some things, again, make some practical application, and kind of also looking forward to the idea of our own solemn assembly here at Carmichael Baptist Church. Not surprisingly, Wednesday night, when I preached that online Bible study for the conclusion to the series on Proverbs, I mentioned October 28th for the date of our solemn assembly. October's already gone, so it's November 28th. But I'm going to tell you that's tentative, and we'll find out a little bit more actually Sunday. We're a little concerned with some of our folks and their health and COVID. So we're going to be praying about that, thinking about that. So listen up and watch for that date in particular. Well, let's begin reading. As we do, we're going to look at the fact that Joshua confronted Israel with a choice. And that's important to understand. Let's look at verse 14 when we see it. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. He confronted Israel with a choice and basically was asking them, are you going to serve Jehovah, or are you going to serve the gods that your fathers served and mixed when they began to worship Jehovah? He started telling them about their history, and he told them about their calling and about God's grace and mercy. And even in that, you can see and they would know about their own unfaithfulness. You look at this and you'll see it as we go through how far back he reached. He reaches all the way back to Abraham. Of course, Abraham was the one chosen by God, and he reminds us that he was the one that was taken from out of that heathen community, and of course from others on the other side of the flood. Abraham was a heathen before God revealed himself to Abraham. Many of their forefathers, probably like ours, were corrupted with idolatry. So the question is, so what will you do? What will this generation do? You are the generation that has now received the promise that God made all the way back to Abraham. Abraham was the one who was going to receive the promise that he promised to Adam and Eve. What did he do? He confronted them with this idea of a need for faithfulness and genuineness. Fear the Lord, serve him with sincerity and in truth. He was asking them and confronting them with the need for them to be dedicated, sanctified, and separated. He confronted them with words requiring action. Twice he uses the word serve. And he also tells them to put away. Look at how they were called to serve. In reverence, in sincerity, in truth. And if you notice again, look at that. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. He's not asking them to think about it, go home and ponder this. He's telling them today is the day, and we've heard that before. Today is the day. Don't put it off any longer. Victory has been achieved. You've received your inheritance. And it's time to make a commitment, both as individuals, as families, and as a nation. Folks, today's Christians are confronted with the same choices. Are you going to serve Jehovah and put away the things that come between you and him? Will you serve him in sincerity and in truth? This is a choice that needs to be made today. Don't put it off any longer. Look back at what God has done. Look at what God is doing and look ahead to what God will do in his promises. Let's keep reading. Now, therefore, he says, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, here's our choice. Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua was confronting and compelling Israel to make a choice. Choose. Every man, every family, every tribe, and this whole nation needed to make a choice. Joshua led them by posing a question before them and asking for an immediate response. I think this day and what Joshua challenged them with, it is the sum and total of his life, and it is the sum and total of his leadership. Because of all these facts, you need to choose. Focus on what God has done. And if we look at Joshua and his leadership comes by telling them that he asked this question of himself first. Before I asked it of the nation, I asked it of myself. And I made my determination, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So he confessed his faith, and of course he was confessing Israel's faith. He admitted to his past sins, to their past sins. He gave concession to the fact that Israel has struggled with serving the Lord and serving him alone. He made a commitment of service, and it's what he's calling for them to do. And I think, too, he's praying for a revival of mercy. Those are the very points of our up-and-coming solemn assembly, that we want to confess our faith. We want to concede that we still struggle spiritually. We're not perfect people, but we also want to make a public commitment to serve God in some way and in the best way that we can. We want to dedicate ourselves to really have a revival of mercy, meaning that we ought to be as merciful to others as God has been to us. You want to change things? Start really realizing what God has done for you and begin to show others the grace and the mercy that God has shown you. You see, life is full of choices, large and small. Joshua was encouraging them and confronted them with a choice, but he wanted them to make an informed choice. Know what you're choosing. So what did he do? He starts talking to them about his confession of faith. Again, but as for me and my house, you can see it on the bottom of the screen. I want to keep that in your mind, though it'll kind of disappear at times as we show some other things. But he wanted to confess and did confess his faith. And you know what he did? The first thing that he confessed was that my faith is in Jehovah God. It is in Jehovah. He's confronted all of these other gods. The gods on the other sides of the floods, the Amorites, Pezerites, all of the other ites that were around. And he knows that Jehovah alone is God. He alone is worthy of our worship, our service, and of our dedication. He is telling them, I want you to see the God that he identifies as Jehovah is the only one worthy of your worship. His name is Jehovah. And he gives you some things to ponder. He begins to talk to them about how that God is personal. He is my God. He's an interactive God. He is our God. He is involved with those whom he has chosen. When you begin to look at what Joshua rehearses for them, he says, this is my God, this is Israel's God, and he puts them in memory of that. We'll see that it's not only that he tells them that he's a personal God, but he's a powerful God. You'll see this when we look at some of these scriptures. Not only powerful, but we'll see that he is selective. We'll see not only that he's selective, but that he's sovereign. God can do anything. And that's important to understand. Look with me at some of these verses that we'll look at about this when Joshua begins to say, and what does he put them in memory of? In verse 2, he says, and Joshua said unto all the people, thus saith the Lord God of Israel. That's why I said it's personal. He's not just out there. He's your God. He's interactive. Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nachor, and they served other gods. And I took your father. Didn't say Abraham found him. Doesn't say Abraham figured it out. He says, I took your father, Abraham, from the other side of the flood, and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed, and gave him Isaac. Again, God took Abraham from the other side. He chose Abraham while he was still a heathen. Much in that we can see in the New Testament how that while you and I were still yet sinners, God showed mercy to us. God showed himself to be merciful and gracious to a man and to a people who do not merit his love. He blessed Abraham. He promised or prospered Abraham, and he promised him a son. That's why it says, and he gave him Isaac. That is a reminder that he is a covenant God. It's a reminder of the power of God. God isn't restricted by our weaknesses of the flesh. God isn't restricted by the laws of nature, if you will, or by the laws of man. He took Abraham and Sarah when they were too old to have children, and he gave him Isaac, the child of promise. But you look back to be talking about that flood. Man was so depraved that God destroyed the world by a flood, and yet he preserved men. He did it through preserving Noah, enabling Abraham and Sarah. God also, it says, besides taking Abraham, it reminds us that he sent Moses. If you look at it, we'll see in just a minute how that Jehovah hears the prayers of his people. He notices their problems. He empowers their efforts, and he fights for them with supernatural force. Look at verse 5 where he says, I sent Moses also and Aaron. I plagued Egypt according to that which I did among them, and afterward I brought you out. God is telling them that I freed you from the most powerful nation that was then on the planet Earth. I brought you out of the house of bondage. Look at it in verse 17. For the Lord our God, he it is that brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and which did those great signs in our sight and preserved us. That's why we're talking about the power of God. He chose, he was selective, and he was sovereign. He preserved us in all the way wherein we went and among all the people through whom we passed. Dear Christian, isn't that the same with you? Didn't God bring you out of the house of bondage? Isn't there a parallel that we can see that when Egypt came after Israel and tried to recapture them and return them to their bondage, God did some pretty mighty miracles course, we know that he destroyed Pharaoh and his army, and it says in verse 7 that he brought the sea upon them and covered them. He also put darkness, remember that, when they were crossing the Red Sea? Miraculous events that shows them his preserving power. They survived that whole wilderness journey. Oh yes, every adult over the age of 20 died. But how is it that then God, in all of that death, preserved a remnant from every tribe? He preserved that nation of Israel and protected them. And to this day, he is telling them, I brought you into your inheritance. I delivered you slaves from the most powerful nation on earth at that time. Think about it. Israel had no weapons, no army. They didn't even have any influence. The only hope they had was to cry unto Jehovah. But God heard them and waged a battle that Egypt had no defense against. Israel had no plan of how to take possession of the promised land, but God did. And what a plan it was. Shh. Just be quiet. Walk around this city's walls for 7 days, and on the seventh day, be quiet until the last, and then shout, and then go up over the walls. Amazing, miraculous power that was shown. God used hornets, he used rocks, and he used an invisible force that the enemy could not stand before. God would cause it to be dark for the enemy that was light for Israel. He would make it dry ground for the people of Israel and muddy for the wheels of the chariots of Pharaoh. Notice what else he says in verse 13. He says, and I have given you a land for which you had not or did not labor, and cities which ye built not, and ye dwell in them. Of vineyards and olive yards which ye planted not, do ye eat. God is telling them, because you are the chosen seed of Abraham, I've redeemed you. I brought you out. I gave you the land that you now enjoy and are sustained by. Christian, it is the same thing for you. God chose you in Jesus Christ before the foundation of the world. He promised to redeem you before the foundation of the world, and he has now accomplished that task. Remember, on the cross of Calvary, he said, it is finished. Have you trusted in the work of Jesus Christ? This way is now unobstructed. He opened it up for all of us through Jesus Christ, through the way of his flesh, through the veil into the Holy of Holies. And it is there that he obtained our eternal redemption. He preserved Israel. He protected them, and he provided them. He really does lay it out for us when you begin to go through the story that God is not only personal and powerful and selective and sovereign, but God is a merciful God. God revealed himself to Abraham because God so chose to do so. And he promised that the seed of Abraham would be this promised seed that he made to Adam and Eve. He's not only a merciful God, but he is a liberating God. He set you free from bondage. He's not only a liberating God, but he's a faithful God. You go through the story of all that you can read there, every nation that was destroyed, even when he tells them about Balak. Balak tried to get Balaam to curse you, he says, but God would not allow it. In fact, God made Balaam bless Israel. So God drove out the enemy. God gave them cities they didn't build, vineyards and olive orchards that they didn't plant, and it sustained them. God is personal, powerful, selective, sovereign, merciful, liberating, faithful, and he's a jealous God. That's why he says, now therefore choose ye. This is put before them as an action required. A response must be given. There must be a putting away of the false gods that they carried with them, if there were any. Just like for you and I, if there's anything that keeps us from being totally and wholly committed to God, we must put that away. There must be a change of direction. Begin to serve Him and Him alone, for God is indeed a jealous God. And Joshua gives them an example. Every man must make their own choice. Every single family must make their own choice. Every church must make their choice. But Joshua says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We will serve Jehovah. Fear the Lord. Reverence Jehovah. Deny yourself and devote yourself. And remember that God will not tolerate a division of faith. He won't tolerate mixed faith. He won't tolerate a false faith. You either believe all the way in God or you don't. Then what else do we learn and see from this passage is we can find that Israel made a choice. We're going to look at verses 16, 17, and 18. Verse 16, and the people answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. They're confessing their faith. They're confessing their choice. For the Lord our God, He it is that brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and which did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way wherein we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. Notice that, the Lord our God. And verse 18, and the Lord drove out from before us all the people, even the Amorites, which dwelt in the land. Therefore, because of this, we will also serve the Lord, for He is our God. You can see what the choices of Israel are. I want to make sure and leave those. You might have a hard time reading them, but I want them each because they remind us of something that Israel did in response to this confronting Israel with a choice. And they made a choice. First off, they said, we will never forsake you. There's no way. Sadly, we know that isn't the case. The same thing that we know with Peter when he said, I'll never let you, Lord. I'll never forsake you. Yet we know he went out and denied Him 3 times after that. But it didn't crush him. He returned from that fall. Ultimately, he never did forsake the Lord. He may have fallen for a time, but he was picked back up by the grace of God. Not only does he talk about we will never forsake the Lord, but he says, for the Lord our God, right at the beginning of that verse, and at the end of verse 18. Again, He's our God. We made a choice. We attached ourselves to Him because He attached Himself to us. They were responding to this question, and they took the encouragement seriously, and they made their choice known publicly. Do you know that's what we do when we respond to God's call to join ourselves to a New Testament church? Listen, you may have been out for a while, but it's time to get back in it. Don't forsake the Lord. Make Him your God. It's a personal. And then lastly, learn to serve God. God redeemed us. God preserved us. God empowered us. God delivered us from slavery, out of bondage. He revealed Himself through great signs in their sight. Listen, you may not have seen the same kind of signs as Israel, but I've seen God save souls. I know that He saved my own soul, and that's the greatest miracle that you and I can ever experience. And we know that God has empowered us, that He protects us, and He preserves us. He makes Him our Savior, our God. So therefore, we will serve Him. If you are hearing this message, you've been confronted with a choice. How will you respond? Will you claim Jehovah as your God alone And knowing that he is a jealous God, knowing that he is the God who redeems and protects and reveals himself, yes, indeed, and he is a God that you can trust, a God who is working all things after the counsel of his own will. And whether I understand that or not, I believe it and I trust him. But are you ready to confess your faith in Jehovah God? Are you ready to make that commitment to follow him and to serve him? Then Joshua, we know, we read it. He wrote that covenant out. He recorded their words and set it in a sacred place. And then what did he do? He sent the people home. He dismissed the official assembly. The solemn assembly was dismissed to go home after they were confronted with the choice and after they made their choice. It's not after you get home that you need to make that choice. It's now. Now, I do want to just say a couple of things as we close. And I hope this study has been of benefit to you. But just to close out with that and not to capture the last couple of verses that are in there, maybe this will just stir you up to think about it a little bit. Once he let the assembly go home, what do we read? And it came to pass after these things that Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died. That's it. He was done, being 110 years old, and they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Serah, which is in Mount Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Goash. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that overlived or outlived Joshua, and all of those which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. What a wonderful testimony. This day, and all these experiences that they've had in the book of Joshua made a lifelong impact on everyone there. The elders, the princes, the judges, everyone who had known all the works of the Lord and all he had done for Israel made sure that those memories did not fade with time. Those people were a living testimony of the work of the Lord and of the mercy and grace and power and of the person of Jehovah God. Do you realize that you, dear Christian, are a living testimony to the work of God? You, dear member of Carmichael Baptist Church, are a testimony to the work of the Lord in this place, and I encourage you to serve him with your whole heart, with your mind, and with your body. I encourage you, go back and restudy this book. Let it enrich you, and may God prosper you. May the Spirit illuminate you, and may Christ speak peace to you. Lord bless you.